The first time they came onto my property, I didn't know it was personal. I thought it was routine. Two men in matching blue polos, fake badges swinging from lanyards, clipboards printed at home, trying to act important. The kind of intimidation you see in movies, the kind you think won't ever happen to you, until one day it does. They knocked on my door like they owned the street, like fear was a currency and they were the bankers. I opened it a crack, pretending confusion, hiding the dread that had settled in my chest. "Morning, sir. Community compliance inspection," the taller one said, chest puffed, voice sharp. Who are you with?" I asked softly. "Auxiliary Enforcement Division. We handle violations before they escalate," he replied, a rehearsed confidence. That should have been obvious, but I let the fear linger on their side. I held up my phone, red recording, glowing. For angles, high definition, their smiles faltered. And then, from the side of my yard, moving quietly through the cedars, came Sheriff Lawson. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a quiet figure in calm authority, like a shadow that finally had substance. "Morning, boys." His voice drifted over the porch, deliberate, measured. Their stance froze, the facade crumbling. "Mind telling me what you're doing on this man's porch?" Lawson asked. "We were conducting a safety inspection," the taller one stammered. "So because I ran your plates earlier and confirmed this vehicle isn't registered to any county or state agency, and isn't a subcontractor?" Lawson's tone didn't rise, but it carried weight. The two men had nothing to say. "It's the authorized contractors." They tried. "Authorized by who?" Lawson's smirk underlined the absurdity of the claim. Impersonating a compliance officer is a crime. And suddenly, a coffee cup, cold in my hand, felt like a small victory. Ow. I had caught them. The Lawn brothers, Karen Bellick's so-called enforcers, thought they could intimidate. But they didn't know I had been waiting, watching, recording. The law was finally on my side. But that morning was just the first ripple. By the time I closed the door behind them, I knew this wasn't about stopping at one encounter. It was the beginning of a fight that had been brewing long before I arrived. Later that day, I dug deeper. Files, reports, screenshots, visual impact analyses, secret expansion plans, and blight preparation outlines. Everything Karen had been planning, I now held in my hands. She wanted the hilltop. She wanted it clean, compliant, stripped of obstacles. They had forged inspector credentials, staged notices, faked enforcement orders, and somehow people just let it happen. I sat on my porch with Crane, an old man who had seen decades of HOA machinations, who had watched communities twist and fracture under petty power plays. He didn't flinch at the pile of documents I laid before him. He just listened, and when I finished, he said quietly, almost with a kind of inevitability, "You stumbled into something folks around here have been whispering about for years." My eyebrows lifted, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, cane creaking against the wooden porch. "Stonecrest Legacy isn't just a HOA, it's a business. Expansion, acquisition, appearances, that's their religion. Everything in this neighborhood is about control. Your house. A wedge, a problem, something they can't manage, but desperately want to." I let that sit for a moment, the sun catching the edges of my folder full of evidence, highlighting threats, forged notices, and lies. "And the Lawn brothers?" I asked. Crane's expression hardened, eyes narrowing with a memory of old fights and worse bullies. "Ross and David, their muscle, nothing more. They failed ethics reviews, flunked psychological checks, yet here they are, strutting like they own the street. Bullies survive by finding crowds too comfortable to fight back." His gaze shifted to my house, quiet, stoic, resistant. "But you, ... you stirred something. And sometimes, that's all it takes." He handed me a sheet of paper, folded, stolen from the trash behind the clubhouse. 8 months old. An internal memo from Karen herself. Preliminary action plan. Hilltop parcel. Taupe. Residence. Bullet points lined up like a sinister blueprint. Target property. bring into compliance, or acquire via code action. Engage law enforcement for intimidation, assess vulnerabilities, apply coordinated pressure, implement notice phase, blight, hazard, convert property for community amenity expansion. Felony level intent printed on a single page. I felt a chill run through me. The realization that everything Crane had said, everything I had found, was now official. And yet, he told me calmly, hit them where they can't hide. Paperwork, sunlight, a damn good attorney. That's how you take down a bully. I exhaled slowly, letting that truth settle. This wasn't anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was strategy. The next morning, I moved. The odd little strip of land next to my property, long ignored, suddenly became the key. Low price, dormant trust, holding title, overlooked by everyone. One call, a signed contract, and the deed transferred into my name. That afternoon, I filed the paperwork. By evening, the sun dipping behind the Maillard Oaks, I wasn't just a homeowner. Anymore, I was a legally recognized HOA, the Historic Stonecrest Society. My one-house HOA, my wedge, my shield. I named it for history, legitimacy, and respectability. I wrote a charter with a single objective: preserve culturally significant structures and prevent interference from external governing bodies. Virginia. Law backed me. Historic preservation priority. My rules trumped Karen's. The moment I hit submit on the filing, a long, low laugh escaped me. This was real, legal, unstoppable. By nightfall, confirmation arrived. Approved. My one-house HOA had power. Karen's expansion plans were suddenly facing a legal wall she hadn't accounted for. Morning brought the first ripple, an email about an administrative hearing. Notices about the proposed expansion review. At the bottom, my HOA was listed, a recognized entity, ready to attend and challenge Stonecrest legacy. I grinned at the audacity of it all. And then, the second ripple, a knock. Karen herself, arms crossed, her thin, brittle smile like a blade. It seems we have overlap, she said. I leaned against the doorframe. Afternoon, Karen. Didn't know we were neighbors. Her jaw twitched, her lips pressed tight. What is this? Association you filed, she demanded. I smiled calmly. A legal entity, one house, fully recognized, able to speak for the historic district. Her nostrils flared, her confidence faltering for the first time in months. You've made a terrible mistake, she murmured. No, I replied. I made a choice. You mistook authority for law. She stormed off slowly, her escalade moving like a threat, deliberate, calculated. By that afternoon, the third ripple hit an email from an anonymous account. Audio attached. Karen's voice. He thinks he's clever. He thinks paperwork will save him. If the city won't act, we have other options. Ross's smug interjections. We can shut him down. Just need the right justification. I hit pause, exhaled, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Desperate people make mistakes. Karen had no idea I wasn't the only one watching, the only one collecting evidence. Didn't know that every move she made dug her own hole deeper. 5 days until the hearing, she would walk in thinking she held all the cards, only to find the law and truth stacked against her. Those days were tense. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. I watched from the porch as white SUVs with vaguely official decals rolled slowly past, to clean, to rehearsed. The fake compliance officers had arrived again. This time they didn't see the cameras, the sensors, or Sheriff Lawson waiting behind the hedges. They thought intimidation would work. They didn't know evidence was already compiled, videos secured, the law enlisted. And when the knock came, I opened the door just enough to let them see me recording. Lawson stepped out from the side yard, calm, deliberate. Their bluff collapsed in seconds. Red-faced, stammering, they walked to the curb like children caught sneaking into class. Coffee in hand, I watched them go, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. But also anticipation. This was only the beginning. Afterward, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of evidence, the HOA memos, the recordings, forged notices, and a plan forming. Every file, every report, every secret they left behind built the foundation for the counterattack. My one-house HOA wasn't just a symbol, it was a weapon. Crane's advice echoed in my mind: don't fight alone. Call the right people, use the law, and let the weight of truth fall where it should. I called Ezra Merritt, the county's top property attorney, a man who despised HOA overreach as much as I did. He smiled when he saw the evidence, that quiet, dangerous smile that meant the end game was near by evening. As the sun set across the Maillard Oaks, I stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was still, windows closed, curtains drawn, the air tense with expectation. My house stood firm, the brass plaque gleaming in the last light. My ownership official, my HOA registered, my protection rooted in history and law. And, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt ready. Not triumphant, not careless, ready. Because the first moves had been made. The first ripples were spreading. Karen had no idea that the one-house HOA built on law, strategy, and history was about to turn the entire battlefield into a game she could no longer control. If you've ever felt powerless in your own home, hit subscribe and tap the bell now. This story isn't over, and you'll want to see how the one-house HOA brings down a multi-million-dollar HOA empire, exposes fraud, and changes the game forever. Asterisk the morning of the hearing, I woke before the sun. Coffee steaming in hand, I paced the porch like a man walking a tightrope. I wasn't nervous, not really, but there was a weight in my chest. I hadn't felt since the first time those fake inspectors showed up. I'd prepared everything. Videos, recordings, forged notices, photographs of the property, deeds, historical, filings all compiled neatly in a folder Ezra had reviewed 3 times. But seeing it all laid out in one place, knowing that, in a few hours, Karen Bellick would sit across from me, smug and armed with her attorney, made my stomach twist. Neighbors had started trickling in, long before the doors opened. The small town gossip network is vicious, precise, and merciless. Word had gotten out about the fake inspections, about my sudden one-house HOA filing. A few faces I knew nodded as I walked by. A woman with a baby in a stroller whispered something I couldn't catch. Kids rode bikes along the sidewalks, their laughter brittle, nervous. You could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken question hanging over the room. Who would come out on top? Who would get exposed? By 9:30 a.m., the hearing room was packed. Every chair was taken, and there were people standing along the walls. Reporters balancing cameras on shoulders, neighbors craning to see the proceedings. The hearing officer, a woman in her 50s with sharp glasses and sharper eyes, called the session to order. "We will begin with the review of the proposed expansion by Stonecrest Legacy," she said. Her voice was firm but not unkind, professional. The kind that could slice through both arrogance and panic without raising it an octave. Karen rose first, adjusting her eggshell blazer, the kind that said expensive taste, and yet failed to convey authority when it truly mattered. Her attorney, polished and confident, spoke before she could. "Madame Hearing Officer," he began, voice smooth, rehearsed. "Stonecrest Legacy seeks approval for minor expansion to preserve uniformity and protect neighborhood aesthetics. The property in question is within the visual influence area of our development. It is in the community's best interest that it come under Stonecrest jurisdiction." He gestured vaguely in my direction, as if to underline my irrelevance. Karen's small, satisfied smile told me she believed victory was already hers. Her confidence was manufactured, built over years of controlling every HOA notice, every inspection, every small escalation to establish dominance. But that smile didn't scare me. Not today. Not after I'd watched the Lawn brothers stumble. Not after I'd filed my one-house HOA. And not after I'd spent nights piecing together every shred of misconduct. Ezra rose slowly, smoothing his tie. "Calm, deliberate, Madame Hearing Officer," he said, voice low but resonant. "Before we discuss expansion, we must establish one foundational fact." He slid a thick folder across the table. Papers fluttered like small flags in the quiet room. My pulse picked up just watching him work. He had the presence of a man who had seen bullies like Karen come and go, and knew exactly which button to press to make their facade crack. This HOA, Ezra continued, eyes meeting mine briefly. The historic Stonecrest Society exists exclusively to preserve culturally significant architecture. It holds historical preservation priority under Virginia Code 10.12204. That priority supersedes any community, aesthetic guidelines, or expansion requests by Stonecrest legacy. The room shifted. Pin could have fallen and made the loudest sound in that tense silence. Karen blinked once, twice. Her mouth twitched. I felt the smallest spark of satisfaction, the tiniest surge of adrenaline. She thought she controlled the narrative, the law, the room itself. She didn't even know what hit her. One house is enough under historic designation law, Ezra said almost conversationally, especially when restoration work is documented and original architectural plans are preserved. Estate historic. Registry review is pending. Therefore, Stonecrest legacy is legally barred from expanding into this zone. Their proposal is invalid as a matter of law. Karen's attorney cleared his throat, hesitation creeping into his polished cadence. But this historic HOA can't simply override. Yes, Ezra replied, almost gently, it can. He opened another folder, slid more evidence across the table. I caught glimpses of documents, timestamps, official filings, everything meticulously prepared. The hearing officer nodded once, decisively. The expansion request is denied on preservation grounds. Her smile faltered. Just a flicker, but it was there. The first crack. Not enough to break her, but enough to make her question, even for a second. The empire she thought she controlled. And then the second act of the hearing began. One I had been preparing for months. Ezra clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up. Footage from my cameras, recordings from my phone, evidence the Lawn brothers had no idea existed. There they were, striding up my driveway, blue polos gleaming in the sunlight, badges swinging, voices smug, threatening. We can initiate mandatory entry if needed. Their arrogance captured forever in digital evidence. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising like a wave. Someone gasped audibly. Ezra let the room settle, then loaded the next clip. Forged stop-work notices, pixelated seals, laughable signatures, all meant to intimidate, all now exposed. Karen's face went pale, a hand clutching the table with a grip so tight it whitened her knuckles. I could feel her pulse through the tension radiating across the room. And then came the recording of her own voice, sharp and unmistakable. That house is a scar on the face of Stonecrest. If the city won't act, we have other options. Officer Land is quite cooperative. The room's reaction was instantaneous. Low murmur, a few startled exclamations, neighbors leaning forward. Reporters adjusting lenses to catch her reaction. She was caught, red-handed, exposed, stripped of her usual armor. Ezra didn't rush. He let her unravel in slow motion, piece by piece. Then came the final blow, a handwritten note she had. Slipped into my mailbox, retrieved, and authenticated. The forensic report confirmed her handwriting with 99.4% probability. That note meant as intimidation became her downfall. The room was silent. Karen's attorney abruptly stood. Madame Hearing Officer, I need to withdraw. My client withheld critical information. I cannot defend this. He turned and left, a calculated escape. Karen's expression froze. Disbelief etched across her features. The hearing officer's voice cut cleanly through the stunned silence. Mrs. Belloc, this evidence shows impersonation of officers, forged notices, coercion, and abuse of authority. This matter will be referred to the Commonwealth's attorney for criminal review. Reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Neighbors whispered, some furious, some relieved, some simply shaking their heads. It was the collective exhale of a neighborhood long strangled by fear and overreach. And in that moment, I realized that all the preparation, the research, the calls to Ezra and Crane, every late night and early morning, had led to this. After the hearing, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder, not celebratory, but lighter, freer. I walked home with Crane beside me, cane tapping against the sidewalk. "First with the law, then with the truth," he said softly. "A 1-2 punch. That's how you take down a bully." The house, my old mansion, stood firm. The porch smelled faintly of polish and the remnants of old wood. I walked slowly, taking in the stained glass, the mahogany arches, the ironwork casting delicate shadows. The work I had done to restore it felt alive now, not just a building, but a statement, protected, grounded, you and bought. Evening fell and I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood breathe again. The air was crisp, the breeze soft, carrying the faint hum of life outside my gate. The knowledge that Karen Bellick had lost control, her authority exposed as fraudulent, sent a quiet thrill through me. But it wasn't triumph. It wasn't gloating. It was justice. Balanced, measured, precise. As I listened to distant traffic, the soft murmur of cicadas, and the occasional bark of a dog, I realized something crucial. Victory wasn't about vengeance. It was about protecting what mattered, preserving what was right, and standing up when everyone else might have stayed quiet. And for the first time since the initial knock on my door, I felt peace. Not loud, not triumphant, just real, earned. Peace. By the next morning, whispers of the hearing had spread. Other neighbors came forward, emboldened with complaints of similar abuses, forging a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Refunds demanded for phantom compliance patrols, complaints filed with the county, the dominoes beginning to fall exactly as Ezra had predicted. The power Karen thought she wielded had cracked, and my one-house HOA had lit the fuse. That night, I sat on the porch again, the sugar-gray dusk settling over the neighborhood. The house felt like home for the first time. No fear, no uncertainty, just the steady pulse of a place I had fought to protect. And now finally owned in the way that mattered most. If you've ever felt powerless against those who think rules don't apply to them, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss the next part. That's when Karen's empire begins to crumble completely. The law, the truth, and a little clever planning bring a bully to her knees. The morning after the hearing felt almost surreal. The sunlight fell across the front yard in long, soft streaks, painting the iron gate in gold. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar weight of dread pressing down on me. Coffee in hand, I walked slowly to the garden, brushing my fingers along the newly trimmed boxwoods. The roses were beginning to bloom, tentative buds of color after months of careful care. It was strange how small victories could feel so monumental when they meant everything. I glanced across the street at Karen's house, curtains drawn, porch, light off, and not a car in sight. It was as though the house itself had sensed the shift in power. For weeks it had radiated control, arrogance, and expectation. Oh, it felt hollow, a shell. Neighbors started appearing cautiously on the sidewalks. A man carrying groceries paused to nod in my direction. A woman with a stroller whispered, "Thank you, just loud enough for me to hear." Word traveled fast in Mired, and apparently justice traveled faster. By late morning, I received my first email. Anonymous tip regarding ongoing HOA misconduct. I opened it carefully. Attachments, audio files, images, all pointing to patterns of intimidation. Forged documents. And aggressive expansion efforts beyond just my property. Karen had underestimated how many people had been keeping records. Quietly watching, waiting. It was as though every secret she'd buried had sprouted into a forest of evidence. All pointing directly at her. The emails kept coming. Each one added a piece to the puzzle. Residents documenting fake inspections. Secret meetings, threats whispered in parking lots. Ross and David, the Lawn brothers, had apparently been making their rounds for years, collecting fear instead of compliance. One recording was particularly chilling. A voice on the phone, low and urgent, discussing a plan to escalate enforcement if anyone resisted, was the final confirmation. She wasn't just aggressive, she was systematic. And now, the system was collapsing under its own weight. I called Ezra. His voice, calm as always, came through the line. I've reviewed the materials. Karen isn't just vulnerable, she's exposed. If we play this right, she could be facing multiple charges, and her HOA will be investigated thoroughly. How fast do you think this will happen? I asked, heart pounding despite the clarity. Faster than she expects, he said. Bullies act fast when cornered, but cornered bullies also make mistakes. You just have to stay ready and let them trip over their own arrogance. By noon, a small gathering of neighbors formed in the street. The first ripple of relief had turned into murmurs of support. Some brought coffee, others just leaned on their fences, watching. It was quiet, but you could feel the air shifting. The fear that had gripped this street was being replaced with something else. Resolve. Then came the first sign that Karen was reacting. A black SUV rolled slowly down the street, tinted windows, looking like every law enforcement vehicle she could conjure in her mind. But I was ready. Cameras she didn't know existed recorded everything. Motion sensors hummed quietly behind hedges. And as always, Sheriff Lawson's cruiser was positioned exactly where it needed to be, invisible, but ready. The SUV crawled past my driveway, cautious, scanning. They didn't see the warning lights, the cameras, the fact that every angle of approach was mapped. There were predators circling a lion who had already been fed. A knock at the door followed. My stomach tightened for a fraction of a second, a reflex from months of harassment, but it was brief. Hi! Two men in blue polos stood on the porch, badges printed from a home office. Confident in the illusion of authority. Morning, sir, the taller one said, voice forced and authoritative. Community compliance inspection? I let my shoulders slump theatrically. Oh, I wasn't aware anything was out of compliance. Please come in. They stepped inside, unaware of the multiple recording devices. The red dot on my phone gleamed. Sheriff Lawson emerged quietly from the side yard. Mind telling me what you're doing on this man's porch? The men froze. Their bluff was over. They weren't real inspectors. They were hired muscle pretending to enforce codes. The sheriff walked past, straightening them without raising his voice. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The cameras. The law and the sheriff had turned their intimidation into evidence against them. Once they left. Karen's response came swiftly via the HOA network. Panicked emails, rushed phone calls, demands for explanations. She was desperate, cornered, and the mistakes started to pile up. Notices were sent without signatures, meetings were scheduled without quorum, and her board members began questioning the ethics of continued compliance patrols. The empire she thought invincible was unraveling in real time. I spent the afternoon documenting everything. Each email, each recording, every irregularity became another brick in the wall that would hold her accountable. Ezra's voice echoed in my mind. Cornered bullies make mistakes. And make mistakes? She did. 2 days later, the county received another batch of complaints, irrefutable and meticulously organized. The clerk assigned them a priority review. Investigators began combing through records, noticing patterns, connecting dots that Karen had assumed were invisible. The dominoes weren't just tipping, they were toppling in a wave. The neighborhood shifted, too. Some residents I barely knew approached me cautiously. Are you really doing something? One asked, eyes wide. Another nodded, adding, We've been scared for years. No one wanted to talk. But seeing this, seeing you stand up, maybe we can. It was surreal. I'd always imagined victory as a private thing, my house safe, my garden preserved. But watching the community begin to reclaim itself, witnessing neighbors find their voices was a reward I hadn't anticipated. Then came the third ripple. An email from an anonymous source, subject line, she's planning another escalation. Attached was an audio file, and I pressed play. Karen's voice filled the room, plotting, calculating, but desperate now, reckless. Her plans had been exposed so many times that clarity was replaced by panic. She underestimated the network of evidence, and people quietly observing, documenting, ready to act if needed. By the next morning, the entire block had noticed a change. Karen's SUV was gone. Her porch light stayed off. Notices were ignored by residents emboldened by what they'd witnessed. Even the Lawn brothers were missing, likely called back to headquarters or hiding until the storm passed. Once dictated, every nuance of life in the neighborhood had lost its grip entirely. I walked through the garden again, my fingers brushing against the climbing roses. Boxwoods perfectly symmetrical, sunlight catching on the stained glass, the mahogany, polished and warm under my fingertips. This was what I had fought for, not just property, but preservation, dignity, the ability to breathe freely in my own home. The calls and emails kept coming over the next few days. Neighbors sharing what they had documented, what they had held back, all now in a central folder with Ezra. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case for criminal review, civil action, and ultimately the reclaiming of our community from fear. And through it all, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph in the traditional sense, but relief. I had stood my ground, faced intimidation, and used the law, evidence, and strategic thinking to protect what mattered. I realized the fight wasn't about Karen, it was about setting a precedent, about showing that even the smallest voice could hold power if wielded carefully and wisely. That evening, I sat on the porch, the neighborhood alive with faint laughter, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft hum of life. Crane called, his voice calm, reflective. You didn't do it for revenge. You did it to protect what couldn't protect itself. That's how victories last, son. That's how legacies are built. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt secure. Not invincible, not untouchable, just safe. My home, my garden, my sanity intact. The HOA's power shattered. Karen's plans exposed. The community slowly breathing again. The lesson was clear. When confronted with bullies who think law is just a suggestion, preparedness, patience, and persistence can level the playing field. And sometimes, victory isn't loud. It's quiet, precise, and irreversible. If you've ever felt powerless against a system designed to intimidate, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next part dives into Karen's final, desperate attempts to reclaim control, the fallout from her board, and how a single house and one determined homeowner changed the course of an entire neighborhood. Won't want to miss it. The morning felt unusually still. Even the creek sounded softer, almost hesitant, as if it were holding its breath. I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the cameras, the gates, the garden, everything meticulously in place. Months of fighting, documenting, and planning had led to this point, and yet there was a strange tension in the air, like the moment right before a storm breaks. I wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, a convoy of county vehicles began appearing, discreet but unmistakable. Investigators, compliance officers, and legal clerks all converging quietly. Professionally, and with authority that Karen had always assumed she wielded, they weren't here for me. They were here for her. Her empire of intimidation forged. Notices. NFO enforcement was being dismantled piece by piece. Then came the phone call from Ezra. His voice was low, but the excitement was unmistakable. They're on their way. Karen won't see this coming. Every violation, every forged document, every intimidation tactic is being logged. The Commonwealth's attorney is reviewing criminal referrals. You've created the perfect storm. I leaned against the gate and let the words settle. Perfect storm. That's what months of fear, tension, and careful planning had produced. A storm that wouldn't break my home, only the facade of control she had built. Around noon, I saw it. Karen's black SUV rolling slowly down the street again, but this time, there was no confidence in the movement, only caution. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the wheel, eyes darting nervously. This was not the Karen who had strutted through the neighborhood, issuing veiled threats and commanding compliance. This was a woman realizing, finally, that the rules were not hers to bend. The first county investigator stepped onto her porch. The Lawn brothers weren't there, likely called back into hiding, but their equipment. Papers and badges were already being confiscated. Karen's expression shifted from confusion to horror as officers read her the notices. Criminal impersonation of officials, forgery of municipal documents, intimidation of residents, and multiple counts of coercion. She tried to argue, to assert her authority, but no one was listening. Legal weight had replaced her manufactured power. Across the street, neighbors peered from windows and porches, holding their breath. Months of fear had held them silent. But now, this was vindication. I watched from my own porch, a silent witness to the unraveling. The air was heavy, but charged like watching fireworks with tension instead of celebration. Ezra appeared beside me, leaning on the railing. "You see that?" he asked softly. I nodded. All the evidence, the recordings, the photos, it's all undeniable. Karen can fight in court, but these are criminal referrals. This is the Commonwealth taking action, not a homeowner with a folder full of complaints. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of updates. Emails confirming investigation, status officers documenting remaining HOA assets, phone calls from residents sharing their stories and evidence. The web Karen had spun for control was dissolving thread by thread. Every revelation fueled the sense of relief washing through the block. People smiled at one another again, exchanged glances of cautious camaraderie, whispered words of encouragement. This neighborhood had been poisoned for too long, and finally the antidote was spreading by evening. The county issued a public notice. The historic Stonecrest Society's single house. HOA was officially recognized in the press as having legal authority over the historic district, giving full precedence over the overreaching policies of Stoner's legacy. Karen's expansion plans were null and void. Any further attempts at intimidation or encroachment would be immediately investigated. And as if to punctuate the moment, reporters filed stories highlighting her misconduct, the fake inspections, and the lengths she had gone to maintain control. Walked the garden again, the roses illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. The air smelled like summer and earth, the boxwoods casting long shadows that interwove with the fading light. I let my hands trail over the stones of the walkway, polished smooth by time and care. And I realized something. Victory was not about the fall of a bully. It was about the reclamation of life, of space, of dignity. Later, Crane called. Was calm, measured, with that hint of wry satisfaction that only comes from seeing justice served. "You've done well, son. This isn't just about you. It's about the people around you. And sometimes, standing up for one house saves 100 others." I smiled. I didn't do it for applause. I did it so the next person doesn't have to fight the way I did. "Exactly," he said. "Remember, it's always quieter after the storm." And it was. The street returned to life at its own pace. Children ran through yards. The mail carrier whistled down the street, and neighbors greeted each other without hesitation. I even caught Ross, one of the Lawn brothers, hurrying down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact. Shoulders hunched like a man who had learned the hard way that fake authority doesn't protect you from the law. I spent the evening inside, able to walk through the house without flinching at every sound, without checking the mail for threats. The stained glass windows caught the soft interior lighting, scattering colors across the foyer. Mahogany gleamed under the polish. Ironwork cast shadows in intricate swirls. This wasn't just a house anymore, it was a sanctuary, a testament to patience, preparation, and perseverance. Evening brought a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Across the street, Karen's home sat silent and empty. Reports suggested she had left town, possibly staying with relatives or a lawyer, attempting to regroup, but this time the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The HOA board scrambled, some resigning, others distancing themselves. Her influence evaporated, leaving behind only the memory of fear she had instilled. I poured a glass of bourbon, stepped onto the porch, and breathed deeply. The air was cool, scented with cut grass and the faint smoke of backyard grills. The neighborhood's quiet was different now. It was filled with relief. The weight of oppression lifted. Crane's words echoed. "Quieter is good." I nodded to myself. Quieter was exactly what we needed. Then came a knock, not urgent, not threatening, but familiar. I opened the door to see Ezra, his briefcase under one arm, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know," he said, stepping inside, "there's something satisfying about watching a plan unfold perfectly." I don't know if I'd call it perfect, I replied, laughing softly. More like careful, calculated, relentless. Nodded. Relentless works just fine. And you've set a precedent. Other neighborhoods, other communities, people will see that standing up matters, that preparation and evidence matter, that even a single house can change everything. We sat in the living room, talking quietly, reflecting on the past months. The garden, the house, the neighborhood, it all felt like it had returned to a natural rhythm. Life wasn't perfect, of course, but there was a sense of justice served, of wrongs addressed, of normalcy reclaiming its place. Over the next few weeks, reports confirmed criminal investigations into Karen and her hired enforcers. Multiple residents filed complaints, inspired by what had happened. The HOA's overreach became a case study for local legal organizations. Cautionary tale for anyone attempting to manipulate authority for personal gain. My house, my garden, my carefully restored sanctuary remained intact, a quiet victory. In a neighborhood that had finally learned how to breathe again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the oaks, I walked the garden, feeling the warmth of the stones underfoot and the gentle sway of the roses. Crane's voice echoed in memory. First the law, then the truth. That's how you take down a bully. I smiled, softly acknowledging the simplicity and power of that lesson. Later, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, the neighborhood alive with faint chatter and distant laughter. No threats, no letters, no fake officers. Just the quiet rhythm of life reclaiming its rightful place. And I whispered, as I had on that first night after everything began, I'm home. Not hiding, not defending, not preparing for the next knock. On the door. It's home. If you've ever felt powerless against authority, whether an HOA, a corrupt system, or a bully in disguise, remember this. Preparation, patience, and evidence are more powerful than fear. Stand for what matters, protect what's yours. And the right allies will appear when you need them most. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to follow the next story, where one ordinary homeowner's courage exposed a network of corruption, proving that even in small towns, one determined person can tip the scales of justice. And remember, quiet victories often echo the loudest.